So we've all heard the stories of increased heat in the desert and less rain, of dying corals in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, of shrinking glaciers in the Arctic and rising Antarctic seas. And we already do know, that those who are most affected by these changing climates are those who have the least to do with them. And so I'd like to begin this discussion by turning to Hindu Omara Ibrahim, who's a coordinator of the Pro-Indigenous People and People's Association of Chad. I know that you have just been at the Indigenous Peoples Climate Conference, and we're going to talk about that a little later on in this discussion. But from your perspective, how is the changing climate impacting your people?
Thank you so much, Sheila, and thank you for this opportunity to be in this forum and share my experience about the climate change impact. Let me first tell you where I come from. I'm coming from Chad, this country in the Sahel regions. I'm coming from the communities who call Mbororo Pastoralists, where we used to follow the water, we followed the rain, and we found the pasture for our cows. We always following the rhythm of the nature that can guide us. But these have changed because of the climate change impact. The impact, you can see this by your eyes. Let me give you the example on water. My people live around Lake Chad. When I was born, it was in 1983. The lake was 60,000 kilometers square large. When my mom was born, it was 25,000 kilometers square of water large. And actually now, it's less than 2,000. And with the population growing, you see, there are more than 30 million people living around this place. But the change is not only on the natural resources, it's also in the seasons. The season changed a lot. Like last year, we get so heavy and irregular rains who come up with a lot of flood. So the crops didn't grow up. And this year, we still do not have any single rain. And normally it's the rain season since 1 month. And that impacts directly the life and livelihood of the peoples. So this is the impact of the food security that we couldn't mitigate in all the Sahel and continuously going to be worse and worse. And the impact of the climate change comes with the huge consequences. That's the conflict between the communities, always fighting to get access to the natural resources. They are fighting not by pleasure to get power, but they are fighting to get food for them peoples. They are fighting for them survival. And of course, with the sad conflict that we are having in our regions, the terrorism one, such as Boko Haram, who's growing around all the species and who taking the opportunity of this. Mm-hmm. And of course, the migration. So the first migration of the communities. Of course, we are talking about the migration around Europe, just like thousands of people or 1 million, not more. But there are internal migration in Africa where people live from one place to another one who create a lot of conflict just because of the climate change. The impacts are huge, but I just stop here now.
That's one community. That's one community of pastoralists in one country, in one region of the world. And we know that those effects are being felt elsewhere. Sabrina Grover, you were the co-chair of the Youth 7 Forum, which was held yesterday, a very exciting forum. And as part of your work with that group, you asked Canadians, young Canadians across the country, a whole series of questions. And some of those had to do with climate and climate change. What did you find out?
Thanks so much, Sheila. First of all, I just want to say I think it's great that we're having youth at this table. I think one of the things we've talked about previously is that women, the idea of women needs to be diverse, and I think having young women at the table is really important. So the Y7 Forum we actually held earlier in April, but we did go through and we did a national digital consultation where we called upon young Canadians. And the reason why we did that is we wanted to make sure that the Y7 was inclusive and representative of all Canadian voices. People who get to attend forums like this and the people who got to attend the Y7 come from a privileged set of young people. And so that's not really an inclusive voice when it comes to things like climate change and gender equality. The questions that we asked young Canadians yielded really similar responses. We asked what do they think sustainable development means to them. We asked questions about what Canada can do better and what Canada needs to take in terms of action. And then we focused specifically on 2 issues that we felt were important within the Canadian context, which is how do we incorporate our Indigenous communities, especially Indigenous youth, into the conversation on climate change, and how do we further the conversation on food security and bring young people into the fold on agriculture. And so some of the things that we heard on what Canada can do better, the focus was really on education. So a lot of young people today don't feel that they're really receiving the right education when it comes to climate change or sustainable development. So really broadening how we talk about sustainable development and incorporating it into primary education, into secondary education. And then hopefully that pushes people into post-secondary, into examining it as part of their actual education and looking at their masters or whatnot from there. And that really ties into what we also heard on the issues of food security. So a lot of young people commented that they feel that there's an urban-rural divide in Canada, and that a lot of youth live in urban spaces, they live in the urban center, and we consume food, but we don't know where it comes from. And we aren't really thinking about that when it comes to a degree, for example. And so we're moving forward on things like AI and technology and all of these things, and agriculture is being left behind, when really that's a core component of Canada. I'm from Alberta originally, and it's like we can't forget that farmers are a huge part of the conversation on climate change, and we need to make sure that young people are engaged in that conversation because they're the protectors of food security in Canada and the ones that can bring that to the next generation. So a lot of young people were like, yeah, we need to make food security sexy again, and we need to make agriculture interesting again. And it's not just like the cow on the farm anymore. Like there's technology that's being implemented in these rural regions that's unbelievable. And then the other big focus that we had with our consultations was the bringing Indigenous voices to the table. So I think in Canada, sometimes we forget that we actually have 4 levels of government, that we need to incorporate Indigenous voices in all of the things that we do. And a lot of young people express that if we're going to actually make progress on reconciliation, we need to bring traditional knowledge to the idea of climate change. This is land that we're gratefully on. And Indigenous voices are the ones that are going to help us reconciliate with not only those communities, but also the land as we move forward. So I think if we don't bridge that divide and bring those people into the conversation and make that conversation inclusive, we're not going to be able to actually achieve the progress that we committed to in Canada.
Turning slightly to focus on the corporate side, Catherine Power, the Vice President of Corporate Affairs for the Internet for Sodexo Canada. Sodexo is not automatically a company that you would think of when you think about climate change and engaging with the issues of climate change. But your company has actually taken some decisions that have put climate change at the center of your corporate responsibility. Tell us about that.
Absolutely, thank you. And honored to be here amongst such amazing men and women. So many women love this. So Sodexo is not a household name. You may not know the company, but we're a global company. We're in 80 countries, and we're a food and facilities management company, which means we feed a lot of people. In fact, we've probably fed you. If you have been in a hospital, gone to school, university, worked in a corporate environment, hopefully not gone to jail. If you competed in the Olympics, in Vancouver even, at the Winter Games, we have fed you. And so we actually feed 75 million people every single day around the world. We have a big impact on food, the production of food, the purchasing of food, and food waste. I'm privileged to work for a company that has incorporated its corporate responsibility strategy embedded it within our actual business strategy. So it is a total part of our business strategy. It's not a nice add-on. And we focus on 3 major initiatives when it comes to our corporate responsibility. One is women and gender parity, one is hunger issues, and the third is food waste. And you might wonder why food waste. But food waste is one of the largest causes of carbon emission in the world, and one of the ways that we can have a big impact on lowering the carbon emissions and impacting climate change. So for example, the food waste numbers are astronomical. If you took all the food waste that happens in Europe and the US, you could feed the world 3 times over. So not only are we wasting water and energy in producing that food and using up valuable land in producing that food, but then it's being thrown away. And all of that creates a whole lot of wasted energy and a whole lot of missed opportunity. And so that's why it's a major focus for us, because we can have a huge impact because we are so large and we feed so many people.
Natalie Pilon, president of ABB Canada. Your company is directly engaged in the climate piece, but how can individual corporations really make a difference when we see globally a disparity amongst governments of how to, even if to tackle this?
Well, I think there's different ways that, first of all, there's what we do with our products, services, and systems that we deliver around the world. So you can look at the product piece, and I say you go back to basic. And you know, one of the initiatives I've led here in Canada with one of our division was to look at, when you make a new product, how do you incorporate sustainability into your product? So start from 0 and try to measure the impact that you can add. Then there's technologies that companies like ours are bringing to market. And for example, we can do microgrids and a lot, and we have other companies in the world that can do that. But oftentimes, what is a microgrid?
What's a microgrid?
I was going to come to this. So a microgrid is really integrating technology. So if you look at remote communities here in Canada in the north, you will have a lot of diesel that is used to power, to bring electricity to these communities. So how can you integrate renewables with diesel? Because you know that there's intermittence in the renewable, and how does the battery portion of this comes in. So you have technology that you can bring, and you see that in Africa. We've done projects in South Africa where we reduce consumption of diesel by 75%.
Wow.
But you need to have the support of government or other institutions to bring that technology to the people that need it the most. And I think that's how we need to step back and say, how can we be at the table? So oftentimes when I was with government here in Canada, I'm telling them, this is not about ABB. This is about me as a Canadian wanting to make a difference in the world. And whether it's our technology or somebody else's technology, this is not what I want. I want us to change the conversation. I want us to align with the goal of government to make a difference in our First Nations, in our communities that we're here. We're all coming here, and you know, we are trying to use those resources. How can we give back, and how can we invest in those communities to make our lives, their lives, better every day?
We are going to be taking questions. Out there are people with microphones, so if you'd like to make an intervention or ask a question, please raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you. We've all talked about the piece involving Indigenous communities and working with Indigenous communities. Hindu, I want to come back to you because, as we mentioned, you were just at the Indigenous Climate Summit, and you had it was very long, it was exhausting, it was very difficult, and then tell us what happened at the end.
It's really more than exhausting. So I was at the last climate negotiation. This is the intersessions in Bonn, just before the next COP in Poland. So we had 10 days of negotiations. Firstly, thanks to the Paris Agreement, who get us for the first time 5 references on indigenous people's rights and indigenous people's knowledge. And after Paris, immediately we went to Morocco in the COP22, where we get the platform of indigenous peoples on traditional knowledge, who is adopting the Paris Agreement. So we still like negotiating just the modality of implementation of this platform. And then when we arrived 10 days ago in Bonn, we were discussing which committee that they want to implement it, how they do that. But instead, just sitting in the table to discuss, it's like the rules and procedure of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. So for us, it was so not correct. You cannot talk about us without us. You cannot talk about our knowledge. You cannot talk about our knowledge and forget our rights, because our knowledge and rights are linked together. So just so they stay putting bracket into comma, and then another countries come and say, no, it's not comma, I prefer to have full stop. And then they put bracket in the full stop. So until the 10 days, today was the end. We didn't get the decision, just so into the modality. So you imagine how it's hard. And all of us agree that climate change is an emergency and we need the solutions. And they agreed to get the solutions. But they block in something very ridiculous, excuse me for the term that I'm calling, just to say may or should, full stop or comma. How are we going to resolve the climate issues if we do not get the right peoples in the tables and we do not go beyond our differences and then get the right implementation that we need? So that's just to happen now. But for us as indigenous peoples, when we came to the tables, we say, listen, you are from the state. Yes, we respect you. You are the world leaders. Yes, we respect you. But don't forget that. You are the world leader. You are black or white. You are from developing or developed countries. We have the common issues. Those 3 commons are the water we drink. You can be anyone. You have to drink water to survive. You can be anyone. You have to breathe the air to survive. You can be anyone. You need the food in your tables to survive. And this food, this water, and this air, they do not have any price. So you cannot negotiate on it. You cannot take people private from it. And that's what indigenous peoples offer to our traditional knowledge. We have a century and thousand of knowledge to keep this biodiversity diverse, to keep this air clean, to share the water in the equitable way, and to put the food in the tables of the peoples who are living in the town. So those knowledges need to be protected, promoted. And the basic issue that they have to give us is this platform to get implemented. We are not implementing for ourselves. We are implementing for all over the world. And it has been very tricky that countries block just this platform of negotiations. It made me in the rage. Because I'm thinking about my
I think we can tell.
I'm not thinking about those who are just around the table, who understand the complexity of the negotiation. But those innocent peoples who are back home, who use the knowledge and who have been forgotten into this negotiation.
This is a perfect example of the gap. We've been talking about bridging the gap, we've been talking about the gap, but this is a perfect example of the gap, and the gap at the highest international level, where you are dealing with world leaders and nation states and indigenous peoples. But there are gaps in other places that exist too. And Catherine, I know that through your work, your company, you have a lot of experience in negotiating with indigenous communities and in understanding what it takes to understand what it is those communities really want.
Absolutely. We've had the privilege of working with Indigenous communities here in Canada for over 30 years, as well as in other countries like across Africa and in Australia and Latin America. I can speak to what we do here in Canada. We have partnerships with over 30 different communities across the country. And that relationship has evolved so much over those 30 years. And it used to really be a transaction of, here's some money, let me come on your land, or here's some money and I'll hire a few of your people. And I'm so happy to say that it has gone so much further than that, to really be about a true partnership and listening to the communities to understand what they need and how we can support them. Not solve their problems, not tell them what they need, not tell them how to do it, but be there to enable where needed, and support where needed. So when we look at the Indigenous communities in Canada, when we look at developing a partnership with them, we look at not only the economic impact, we look at the education and training, we look at health and wellness, but we also look at culture and language, and we look at just the overall impact on the environment that they live in. And they inform us on what those benefits are, what they need from us in all those areas, not just the economic, yes, I'll take your money, big company. And that has made for such richer relationships, stronger relationships, and more fruitful relationships. We benefit, obviously we're a publicly traded company, we are there to do business, so we benefit, but they also benefit hugely from the new generation of partnerships that we've been able to create, and it's great to see the fruition of those relationships evolve.
Sabrina, one of the things that you were talking about was, or that young people in your survey were talking about, was the need to engage with Indigenous communities. Did they have specific suggestions about how those communities, or even other groups, you talked about youth education, for example, other groups could be engaged in this?
Yeah, I think it does come back down to the idea of education. So a lot of folks raised the idea that we don't really learn about traditional Indigenous culture in our education system. And I'm speaking just from the Canadian perspective. But we can talk about history and what happened, but that's not really addressing the actual gap and addressing reconciliation that we have today. So actually incorporating Indigenous culture and understanding into the education system, I think, is a really big part of bringing that voice to the table. We don't want to be talking about people, we don't want to be talking at people, we need to be talking with people. And that was actually something that we really pushed for at the Y7, and I would hope to see at the G7, and I would hope to see at other international forums, especially in places like Canada, where we have a strong Indigenous population. We incorporated Indigenous culture into the summit itself. We had an Indigenous cultural evening. We had it catered by somebody who was Indigenous. We actually had an explanation. We didn't just do a land acknowledgement, we talked about why we do land acknowledgements. And I think that is really important. Our head delegate to the Y7 is a Métis woman in Canada, a Métis Jamaican woman, and she was able to bridge those cultural gaps. So it's great to do a land acknowledgement, it's great to talk about Indigenous culture, but if we're not going to actually embody it and bring those voices to the table and have those small businesses come and engage with our communities, if we're not going to talk about the racism and the bullying that young Indigenous people have faced, then we're not going to be able to move forward. So we were really proud to have that experience and share it with other youth from the G7 countries. That was something they'd never experienced. They didn't know that there were thousands of Indigenous languages in Canada. They didn't know that we don't give status to those languages. They didn't know why we do a land acknowledgement. So if we're going to really bring those voices to the table, then we need to share our story, and we need to share their stories and actually incorporate them in the discussion.
So going forward, Natalie, if I could turn to you, this question of innovation, you've talked a lot about innovation, you've talked about the need for innovation. Who's going to pay?
I think, earlier this morning you were talking about how do you integrate this differently in your business model going forward. And I think that's how we need to have those conversations so that we calculate social benefits in a different way. And I think we need to be creative. So there's a lot of people, we have solutions, and I try to have conversation with people where we have solutions somebody needs to pay, but there's a return on investment. So now I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to go see a banker who's going to be ready to put those solutions on rail systems, for example, where there could be free electricity coming back, but you have the operator and you have the infrastructure builder, and they have different models to go forward. So it's how do you link those, and how do you bring that conversation forward, and how do you have that conversation earlier? That, I think, is the challenge of what we're going through right now in innovation. And if you take how far we were having that conversation just before, how far on electricity are on trains and our mobility here in Canada, we're so far behind, but there's so much to be done. We can make such a big difference on making people travel faster, better, in a much more efficient way. But for that, we all need to change how we're looking at this. And that's on a daily basis. How do we get to the airport when we get to Europe? It's small gestures that we need to incorporate so that we reflect at every big time that we have to do investment in Canada to say, how can we integrate these innovations to better the world for the future? So it's not looking just at the money today. I think, the person from NACAIS was talking of, from Ivanhoe Cambridge, it's that long-term impact. And I think we need to integrate this in our models. And what we're doing now, as ABB just partnered with the Formula E. And for us that are from Montreal, we had a little issue with Formula E last year. I think it costed the mayor his job probably. But, as a company, we associated ourselves with Formula E. And that was, for me, we're not a consumer business. But that for me was like, wow, we're trying to change the conversation here. So it was a very proud moment to say, okay, we're giving a title to a race, which, when you talk to the International Federation, they never wanted to do that. But it's just to say, we need to change. So there was a race in Paris last week. There's going to be one in New York. And now we're trying to change the conversation. So people look at, remove the range anxiety. How can we bring this into our world?
One area I'd like us to talk about is if we're in an environment, an international environment, where there are those who are reluctant to move forward, perhaps for their own economic interests, perhaps for their own political interests. We have I live in Washington, D.C., and we have a head of the Environmental Protection Agency now who has banned his scientists and researchers from using the words climate change. You can no longer talk about climate change if you're at the EPA. So the question I want to ask is, how much can corporations, individuals, communities do if they essentially are doing it without larger national guidance? What's the range of the possible? And Natalie, let me start with you again, because I know you made a decision in your own company that is maybe indicative of that.
Yeah, I started on sustainable development maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and I was trying to affect people in their daily lives. So we banned water bottles. And so when I had to take this water bottle, it was like, okay, I need to drink, so I will do that. So we brought this into the new campus. We went into an open concept. The other thing we brought is we did a dumpster dive. So we dressed up and we went to see what we had in our garbage in the back. And we realized that we were throwing little garbage bags at each of our desks. So when we went to our new campus, we banned having a garbage can at our desk. So people were looking at me, what am I going to do with my Kleenex? I said, you'll get up, so it's health and safety. You get up, you don't keep sitting, and you go, you need to decide if you're going to do compost, recycling, or trash. These are small gestures, but this starts the conversation at the base. And that translates into people bringing this to their home, and we're trying to educate what goes into which bin. And I think that's where we have a responsibility. I didn't wait for somebody to give me that guidance. I didn't wait for the group. We are, we're obeying by the sustainable guidance from the UN, but I didn't wait for that. I thought, I have a responsibility. I have all these people. Let me make a difference. Let me impact their lives. And it's funny because people say, oh, we don't have paper here because of Natalie. We don't have this because of Natalie, which is fine, because I think that's the conversation we need to have and continue to have, so that everything we do, and food is a big one, that when we see the waste that we have, I always challenge people, how can we bring this to somebody else rather than throw it? So.
Catherine.
I think as large global corporations, there's so much opportunity to fill the void where governments may be lacking. And we certainly saw that after Paris and the U.S. stepping away from the Paris Accord, and the big company CEOs stepping in and saying, we won't let the U.S. fall behind, which was an amazing, amazing statement, I think. For us, I think where we can have some of the biggest impact beyond our employees and the clients that we serve and how we manage what we serve is in our supply chain. We have over 150,000 businesses in our supply chain that we buy from. We have a lot of buying power. We can mandate who we will buy from and why. And so we have different protocols, such as we will only purchase sustainable seafood, for example. We will only buy environmentally friendly cleaning products, for example. Or we do things like we have strong programs to buy from Indigenous-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, small enterprises, to really grow those local communities. We feel we have a responsibility to the communities where we work and where we serve our clients, and so we buy local. And I think all of those things have an impact on the climate and the people who live in those communities, and gives them that economic freedom to make change. And we can throw our weight around because we're big enough to do that. And I think large corporations like ours are realizing the power that we have to push for that change when the governments aren't necessarily stepping up.
Again, we do have microphones, so for anyone who would like to ask a question, please, we have a microphone here. Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria McNabb, and I'm one of the 50 youth who is attending the conference. Today, I'm really grateful to be here. For the sake of time, I'll just get right to it. So my question is, what are some of the capabilities you have seen that youth have, or you would like to see youth bring to the table in order to bridge the gap?
Do we have another question right away? Great, thank you.
Hi, good evening. Yes, good evening, everyone. I'm Habiba Cooper Jallo. I build awareness about a maternal health condition called obstetric fistula. My question will be really quick. It's directed at Hindu Ibrahim. So in one of your videos that I watched, you stated that Western countries have to bear most of the responsibility for the devastating effects of climate change that are affecting indigenous communities like your own. So I just want to know, what is the connection between Western countries and the effects being felt in places like Africa? You know, herders not being able to find water or grazing lands for their animals. Why is it that Western countries need to be more responsible, as you say? That's my question.
Hindu, let's start with that question. Why is it the responsibility of Western countries?
I think the responsibility of the Western countries on the climate change is since the industrializations. They are the one who took all the natural resources to get developed, to get where they are now. And those who are left behind are the developing countries, and most of them are the African countries. And that's why they have to take the full responsibility to mitigate the climate change and to help peoples to get adapted in our countries. And we ask this responsibility, who is already in the Convention of the Climate Change, they have to mitigate it in two ways. Firstly, transferring the technology that they do have without any boundary that you have to pay for it, or you have to, I don't know, get access it by sending back money to the developed countries. Second is financial issues, because we cannot be adapt or mitigate without financial mechanism and without huge funding to those countries who are needed not only to adapt, but also the development. And that can make the equity and justice. But still, they are not respecting the responsibility Because in all the negotiations, we still starting in how much money that we have. Did you reach the criteria that we put before to get the funding? So for us, it's not the issue of criteria. Do you know country like Chad, where the people speak Arabic and French, and the negotiation is happening in English, where they have, like all the developed country, 200 persons in the delegations, and as Chad, we have 2 persons who will come. How they can chair themselves to attend all the finance or all the negotiations agenda item during the day, and they do not forcefully speak English, how they can make themselves benefit from the discussions. So this inequity and injustice that we need to be respected and implemented by developing countries.
Thank you, Hindu. Let's turn now to that first question. Sabrina, you want to take that?
Yeah, and I want to tie it back to the question that you asked just a few minutes ago about how we deal with people who aren't really at the conversation. I think that organizations that refuse to engage in a conversation write themselves out of action, of consumerism, of entrepreneurship. Like, I think they just basically write themselves out. Some wisdom that I heard at a panel a few weeks ago was, you don't need to be at every table, you need to be at the tables that are worth it. And that's something that I think consumers have the power to do. So for youth, youth have the power to have these bold, audacious ideas. That was the theme of our Y7 Summit. And they have the power to buy from companies that are meeting the goals of environmental sustainability. They have the power to be employed by companies that are meeting those goals, and they have the power to ask for those things. Youth are a generation that don't only have that buying power, but they have that social media power. More than any other generation that has come before them, and they're not afraid to speak up. So I think that's really important. And I just think that, like companies that aren't willing to bring themselves to the table are going to write themselves out of the conversation. As I mentioned, I'm from Alberta, and obviously our big industry is oil and gas. And oil and gas takes a lot of hits, but those companies brought themselves to the table. They recognize the impact of the recession. They recognize the impact of climate change, and a lot of them are supporting things like the carbon tax, where we can see governments maybe aren't, and we can see politicians aren't. And that's not just because they want to be at the conversation. That's because they know that consumers and young people are not going to stand for companies that don't engage in that.
Natalie.
I would add to the young people, I think, we're going to be in a shortage of people. So you're in the driving seat. And I've seen this in interviews where people are interviewing me when I'm looking for someone. Mm-hmm. And I love that conversation because, that's exactly why I embarked on the sustainable development, was to say I want to attract and retain young people. I want to speak to them. I know it's important to me, but it's important to you more than anything, and make that voice heard.
Questions? I'm sorry, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brittany. I was able to attend the WE conference yesterday where I was able to hear you speak about the Y7 Summit. And I was just wondering, we talked a lot about climate change yesterday as well, but I noticed that we kind of avoid the topic of meat consumption. And maybe you guys do talk about it. I wasn't able to attend. It's something I'm just learning about. But it's the second biggest polluter in the world after the oil industry. But yet, when we talk about climate change, it's always little actions like the garbage can stuff. That's such a great idea. But how do we bring up, like, this is a huge issue and we're destroying the Amazon rainforest to make sure that we have grass for cows to feed, for them to feed us, but we're overeating our meat consumption. So is that something that is discussed about, or maybe now can be considered to be talked about?
Sabrina.
That's a really great point, and I'll be honest, we actually didn't discuss that at the Y7 Summit. That is something that I think is important, and that's why I brought up the idea of tying climate change to food security and agriculture, so that the more that we can encourage young people to learn about food security and agriculture and the impacts of agriculture on climate change and the ways that they're moving forward, the more we can encourage people to maybe go plant-based, look at different options, meatless Mondays. I think that's also something that young people engage in on social media. So it may not be a conversation that we're having at the Y7 Summit, and I agree, I think that's a lack of oversight on our part, but I think it's definitely a conversation that young people are having and moving forward. and encouraging other people to come along.
In the few minutes that we've got left, I think we want to turn to the piece about what do we want to say to the G7? What are the recommendations? What do we want them to hear? What are the voices that we want them to hear on this subject? Action, concrete action that we would ask them to consider. So, Sabrina, I know that your Y7 group has got some recommendations.
So the way that we framed our recommendations to the G7 is that we framed them in a future vision status. So we wanted to see what world do young people want to see in 2030, and what actions can the G7 take to get there. So we put forward two recommendations, one on the G7 for 2018 and one for 2024. And so essentially for 2018, that's the G7 summit in June, in just over a
Quebec.
month. We call upon the G7 to fully ban microplastics in cosmetics with ambitious targets to quickly phase out other harmful plastics. And we also want to establish a G7 working group that generates innovative ways to protect our bodies of water related to the microplastics, but including the idea of giving water legal rights, which is something that has been discussed at the UN by a number of groups, especially Indigenous groups, and the establishment of protected areas. And then by 2024, we asked the G7 to have just a broader plan on the revitalization and sustainability of water bodies.
Hindu, can I ask you, what would you want to say to the G7? What recommendation would you want to make to the G7, other than obviously respecting Indigenous people and listening to Indigenous people?
I think all of them are concerned about migrations. But that it is time now, ever, to take the decision, give the legal status of the climate refugees. I say that because there are many indigenous peoples from island or from my regions who are forced to become a climate refugee. And maybe the land will be forgotten forever. So it's not about the economy that they have to talk. It's not about the security that they have to talk. They have to talk about the future and identity of this human being who will be forced to leave the land, territory, resources, and to become another peoples who need the protections. So we really need that right now in this G7 summit.
Catherine and Natalie, if you were to come up with a recommendation for the G7, we've heard the really big notion of creating and recognizing climate refugees, of banning microplastics, of moving forward to further reduce plastic use. What kinds of things do you think are attainable that you could go to the G7 with and have them agree to implement?
I will go outside of what you would think I would touch, but there's one thing that as I travel to Alberta and I speak with customers on the energy sector that are transforming, one thing that always bothers me in the conversation we're having in Canada is that because of COP21 looks at the impact of greenhouse gas emission in the country, not in the world.
Right.
We are not doing the right things for society as a whole. We have technologies, we have resources that we could bring, but we're looking at it in a very microcosm of Canada and not looking at what we're doing and what we could do in Africa with some of the resources that we have, and put the pressure on our companies here in Canada to better what they're doing. And they've done so great. And I've been telling them, because I live out east, I live in Montreal, I've been telling them, your story is not being told properly. And it's really unfortunate. But if we would look at the impact of what we do in the globe, not on Canada, we would have a much different world.
Catherine.
I think one of the shortcomings of politics is that it's by nature short-term view. Politicians are always looking to, how are they going to win the next election, and it makes it very difficult for them to look at long-term impact and make those audacious goals and commitments that may not see immediate return, but in the long run are the best thing for the people around the world. And I think I would encourage them to reach out to businesses, large and small, entrepreneurial, community-based, to engage those populations to make change today, because our Indigenous peoples look at 7 generations. They look at, what am I doing today that will help or hurt 7 generations from now? And every decision that they make is based on those 7 generations. Unfortunately, climate change is not a 7-generation impact, it's a today impact. And so we need to act today and have those audacious, bold goals and commitments that may be tough politically, but necessary for the planet.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.